Hello everyone, welcome back. Today we're going to talk about chapter 4, which is about humans, the plane brain. So the first thing that Rod talks about is decisions, and two important categories for decisions. We have decisions that are time constrained and not time constrained. Important thing to note, and Rod points this out, is that often when you have decisions that aren't time constrained, those tend to be the more important decisions. If you look at accident statistics, things like pre-flight decisions that were made are not time constrained decisions, and a huge percentage of accidents can be tied back to decisions that were not time constrained. In other words, decisions that you had plenty of time to do, make the right choice, and you didn't. So, as you're flying IFR, obviously, what should you do? As I said before, flying IFR to me is a lot about learning to fly with precision, getting organized. Do as much as you can before you get in that plane. Don't put yourself in a bad situation. Other things he talks about, 80% of flights that involve poor decisions, according to Rod, those were not time-constrained decisions. That, in other words, people should have had all the time in the world to react to that. He talks a little bit about planning, things like fuel starvation, still a big problem. 70% fuel exhaustion. Accidents occur within 10 miles of the destination. So you get a lot of people that, just don't plan very well. They're like, well, I'm pretty close. It's not horseshoes though. You run out of gas before you get there. That's a bad thing. Talking about things that influence our decisions. We have our knowledge. What did we learn as a private pilot? What did we learn in a class like this, through flying, etc.? And then we have skill. This comes from practice. One of the things Rod says is that, for knowledge, you should be reading. And he's saying that you pretty much should be reading 1 to 2 books a month, as well as subscribing to various aviation magazines. So, I would agree 1 to 2 books a month. That's really not that much to read. Some good magazines as well. Of course, you can ask what's a good magazine. Depends. If you're an EAA member, obviously you're already getting a magazine for that. There are some other decent aviation magazines out there. Some of them are mainstream ones. Not a huge fan, but that's just the way that goes. When it comes to skills, practice is good. Before I've talked about fly sim is a good method for learning to fly IFR. And again, PC simulator can help you out with some of this in developing those skills. And of course, the closer it is to the actual aircraft you're going to fly, the better off you are. The next thing I want to talk about, which again, we're just highlighting some of the things from Rod's book, is hazardous attitudes. This is something that you studied for your private pilot, and this was on your knowledge test, and guess what? It'll be there again. What are the things that influence our behavior in bad ways? We have things like peer pressure. where you feel like, hey, I have to make this flight. I have to be that super pilot. I don't want to let my friends down. Giving you a personal example, one time I took a trip up to Minneapolis with some friends. We went to a conference. When it was time to go home, the weather was pretty bad, and one of the radios in the plane had failed on the way up, leaving us with one radio to fly home on. Really struggled, and I looked at that and I said, you know what, if this other radio fails and we're in instrument conditions, it's not going to be good for us. And we made the decision to drive. So we drove home. Week later we went back, picked up the plane. It wasn't a big deal, right? So don't feel pressured all the time. We've got the get there-itis. You know, you really want to get there, get to your destination. Again, don't be in a rush. It's better to get there safely than it is to push things. We have our duck under syndrome. This idea that, hey, I'm sure if I go just a little bit lower, I'll be out of the clouds and I'll be able to see everything and do what I need to do. Related to that, we have scud running. Another personal example, I won't give you all the details to protect the guilty, which wasn't me actually this time. I was flying somewhere with someone, and controllers asked us, what do you want to use for an instrument approach into your destination? And I said, how about this approach? And then he got on the radio and said, oh, actually, I think we can take it in visually. Right? And he was familiar with the area and proceeded to go to some ridiculously low altitude and scud run all the way in. Don't recommend things like that. VFR into IMC. Big problem. People are continuing to fly VFR into instrument conditions, getting behind the aircraft. I just realized I have the wrong label on this, but these are factors that affect bad decisions. So anyway, getting behind the aircraft. You know, if it's a new plane, it's a little bit faster than you're used to. You can get behind the curve, and this is where getting organized, getting all your stuff set, getting your radio set, getting everything briefed before you ever leave the ground is very important in an instrument. Not having fuel, low fuel, running out of gas. You need 45 minutes of fuel to be able to fly to your destination, to an alternate if it's required, do an approach there, and fly for 45 more minutes. That's a lot of fuel. People who get below minimum en route altitudes, which I know we haven't talked about yet, but there are reasons why we have minimum en route altitudes. So don't just descend below those and think it'll be okay. Other things that can be problems outside the envelope. All right, so when you're outside the envelope, that just means, you know, you're flying too fast, you're overstressing the airplane, etc., etc. Maybe it's overweight, out of CG, not planning. Bad plan. You don't have current charts. You don't have any calculations that you did. So these are all things that can contribute to bad decisions. Then, finally, you have those hazardous attitudes, and those you covered in your private pilot ground school. If you look in your book at Figure 2, they talk about things like anti-authority. Don't tell me what to do. Don't tell me how to be safe. Antidote for that. There's a reason why we have rules, right? Impulsivity. Let's just do it. Do something quick. Antidote. Stop and think. Invulnerability. Bad things don't happen to me. Well, guess what? Sometimes they do. You never know. It could happen to you. Macho attitudes. I can do it. I'm going to go buzz somebody's house, and there's a lot of accidents happen from things like that. Antidote, realize taking chances for no reason is just dumb. Resignation. What's the use, right? Person that's coming, like they're driving their car and it looks like they're going to have an accident, and they go like this, right? That's resignation. Something goes bad, you keep on flying it, you keep on trying to work the problem until you can't work it anymore. Don't give up. So those are some of the attitudes and issues that can lead you to making bad decisions. Some of the other things that Rod talks about in this chapter, things like CRM, crew resource management, and how that can help you. You might think, but I'm flying by myself. If you have other resources, leverage them. An autopilot is a resource. A passenger who might not even be a pilot can be a resource. Maybe they can hold stuff. Maybe they can work the radios. It depends on what they're able to do. So autopilots, really helpful. I was talking to an instrument pilot just today about this. Having a decent autopilot, and even if you have a cruddy single-axis autopilot, it is better than not. You start getting into 2- and 3-axis autopilots, they can really reduce your workload in an instrument environment. When you look at your performance throughout the flight, this is figure 3 in your book. You have the level of effort required and then different phases of flight. Right, you have pre-flight, and then you take off, you're en route, cruising, maybe you have an approach, landing, and you say, what's the effort required? Down here when you're pre-flighting, not a lot, you take off, cruise pretty easy. Now I'm going to fly an approach, landing, right? And so my curve looks kind of like this, and then on top of this we have our capabilities curve. So we start out nice and fresh, and if this is a long flight, what happens? That's our capabilities, and this area in the middle, this is our cushion. That's our margin of safety. And you'll notice that I almost intersected these two curves. That's bad. You don't have a lot of margin. I'm kind of tired, and things got really intense. So things to keep in mind. When he talks about things like your workload, if ATC calls you and you're busy, it's okay to tell them to stand by, right? Don't feel like, oh, they called me, I have to stop what I'm doing or what I'm in the middle of and answer them. Tell them to stand by, they'll get over it. There are different models of decision making. Again, these are things that you tend to find on knowledge tests. This is ADM, aeronautical decision making. And one very common model is the DECIDE model, where you detect something has changed, you estimate what you need to do to react to that, you choose what to do, you identify the actions that could successfully control the change, you do it, you do what you decided to do, and then you evaluate the result. So that's a very common model for decision making. From there, Rod goes into various physiological factors, and he talks about things like spatial disorientation. Sometimes people incorrectly call that vertigo, but spatial disorientation, what happens, and again, this is review, you have the fluid in your ears, you have your 3-axis gyro system, if you will, and sometimes that fluid can start spinning and you get disoriented. And of course, things like severe head colds do not help that situation. Other things he talks about, in-flight illusions. Things like the leans, or the Coriolis effect, graveyard spirals, etc., etc. I'm not going to go through all of these, but those are in figure 10 in your book. There are some nighttime effects that you might run into. Things like false horizons. This is another thing that personally I've experienced when I was a student pilot, flying at night. Often you're flying at night, you're a little bit tired because you worked all day. So you're flying along, and my instructor said, hey, let's make a turn to this heading. I made a turn, and then I kept on turning and turning and turning. And he's like, what are you doing? And the answer was, well, I thought I had rolled out of the turn because I saw a really straight road with lights on it, and I thought that was my horizon, but I was wrong. So that is a very common nighttime illusion that you can run into. And of course, Rod talks about things like your eye, how does it look, the rods and cones. That's review from private pilot stuff. So I would encourage you to look through that. Talks about different blind spots that you're going to see. And of course, that's going to vary between high wing and low wing aircraft. Other physiological factors. He talks about hypoxia, when you don't have enough oxygen. How does that happen? Things like going up too high. Remember what the rules say. The rules say if you're above 12,500 for more than a half hour, you need oxygen. If you're above 14,000 at all, you as the pilot need oxygen. If you're above 15,000, you must provide oxygen to your passengers, but you don't have to make them use it. If you start getting into the instrument system, you're starting to fly IFR, you might actually be flying at those higher altitudes now. Maybe when you were just the VFR only guy, you're not really going above like 8,000 or 9,000 feet. Other things you should realize as you get older, the altitude effectively drops for you. If you're a smoker, you can lower your altitude tolerance, if you will. It can essentially raise your altitude as much as 5,000 to 7,000 feet. So you can start getting hypoxic at 5,000 feet in the air, whereas a healthy person doesn't. Also, nighttime oxygen requirements are a little bit higher. People are a little bit tired. I know some pilots will actually use some oxygen before they come into land at night if they have it available. So these are things to keep in mind. Your book talks about useful consciousness. How much time could you maintain your senses and do anything at different altitudes, and there's a chart in your book all about that. Hyperventilation tends to be less of a problem. You all know how to deal with that. Then we have carbon monoxide. Definitely in the wintertime especially, would recommend carbon monoxide detector in your aircraft. You're flying around in the clouds, etc. And all of a sudden you're like, hey, I'm feeling a little bit strange. Maybe it's because you got carbon monoxide from your cabin heater. Okay, another common checklist. I am safe. So the first I is illness. Do I feel off? Do I have problems? Like, do I have a sinus problem? Do I have clogged eustachian tubes? I can't clear my ears as I go up and down. I'm going to be in a lot of pain. That can really stink. If you fly skydivers like I do some days, you're like, ooh, I didn't realize I had a problem until I went up to 11,000 feet and then back down real quick. Medication. Am I taking anything that my aviation medical examiner wouldn't approve of, and or anything that's going to make me drowsy? Does it say don't operate heavy equipment or drive? Well, probably shouldn't fly either. Am I being stressed? Stress can be caused by good things and bad things, both. So that's something else to think about. Do I have a lot of change going on? Right now as I'm recording this, a lot of people are kind of stressed out because of this whole pandemic thing that's going on. A lot of restrictions by some governments and things like that. So things to be aware of. Alcohol. Same rules apply, 8 hours, bottle to throttle, and what's your blood alcohol content. Now you might say 8 hours, a lot of people will say 24 hours. Yeah, if you were doing some heavy drinking 9 hours ago and you're hungover, probably should be fine. Fatigue, am I just tired? And finally, did you eat? Right? Are you hungry? If you don't have that fuel for your body, that's a bad. So that is a good summary of Chapter 4, all about physiological factors and decision making, etc., etc.